As tests by Peter Jones have shown, even an arrow from a light 70-pound draw longbow could effectively penetrate a 1.5 millimeter steel plate, which was thicker than the armor leg protection in medieval armor, even when it hit at 45 degrees angle. It was obviously more effective when it hit dead on. A Mary Rose longbow, as tests by Mark Stretton illustrate, could penetrate well into the breastplate of a modern steel, made out of modern steel, and inflict a lethal wound on the user or the wearer. This is a test against a freshly dead pig to give it the resistance of flesh behind the armor. The pig was not alive and not killed for this purpose. No animals were harmed. But you can see. Oops, I'm sorry. No, he was already dead. So this is the inside of the breastplate, showing the penetration of the head through the breastplate. And then this is it. They took off the breastplate, opened up the carcass, and reinserted the arrow to the same depth to show how far into the rib cage the arrowhead had penetrated. So a full-strength longbow was infinitely more dangerous to well-armored opponents than was a wooden shortbow. It had double range or so, its rate of fire was about the same, and it was more accurate. Clearly, in the hands of a more skilled user, it was more effective than the shortbow. Now what about the longbow in comparison to its other two contemporary main competitors? In addition to the shortbow on the left, the crossbow, and the composite recurved bow, which is a bow made out of horn, wood, and sinew glued together, which enables it to be drawn a longer distance even when it's a short bow, in the sort of 80-pound range. Whereas the heavier steel-bowed crossbows of the 15th century, which were cocked with a windlass-type mechanism, were about equal in their energy storage capability to one of the really strong Mary Rose longbows. But all crossbows were far inferior longbows, both in long-range accuracy and in rate of fire. The 14th century chronicler Giovanni Villani reasonably estimated that the English archers at Crecy loosed 3 arrows in the time it took a Genoese crossbowman using the belt-hook method, which was the faster of the two crossbow methods, to return 1 bolt. A weapon with comparable power, triple the rate of fire, and double the accurate range can fairly be said to be clearly superior to its competitor. The composite shortbow, which was the weapon most favored in the Middle East and on the steppes, as John France said this morning, but also was sometimes used in Europe, could be drawn further than a wooden shortbow without breaking, so it could impart more energy to its arrows. You could do the full draw to the ear, even though it was a short bow. Still, it was generally much less powerful and much less effective against armored targets than was a longbow. On this slide here, these two, this is based on experimental testing. These two are composite bows of Eastern style, one of Egyptian make, it's a replica of the one from the tomb of Ramses II, and one a Crimean war bow. And you see that in the joules of energy they provided, it was sort of just enough to go through a plate, but not enough to do much damage after it did it. Whereas after penetrating a metal plate, a Mary Rose bow still had more energy than left over than the Egyptian bow had to start with. All right. Some composite bows were more powerful even than the one shown here. It seems that some of the Ottoman Turkish bows, based on a sample from museum collections, had a median draw weight of around 115 pounds, and they could actually surpass one of the weaker longbows, so the 80-90 pound draw weight longbows, in their kinetic energy. But even compared to those weak longbows, they would be somewhat higher in kinetic energy, but lower in the momentum of the arrow. And the kinetic energy basically breaks the armor, and then the momentum keeps the arrow going forward to actually inflict damage. The composite shortbow could be fired somewhat more rapidly than the longbow, but it was a fairly useless advantage because you could already fire the longbow as fast as you would ever need to, because you could fast enough to stop an enemy's charge, and you would run out of ammunition very quickly if you tried to fire even at the full rate that a longbow could do, much less a shortbow. The composite shortbow was somewhat less accurate than the longbow. It did have one big advantage, which was that it could be fired from horseback, and that led to the dominance of the steppe warriors that John Franz talked about this morning. But again, I've accounted for that in the way I phrased my thesis by saying that in its ability to do serious damage, the longbow was still the superior weapon. All right, so can we say then that the longbow deserves to be considered a decisive weapon? Well, the definition of a decisive weapon is something having the power or capacity of deciding, determining, or having the power to determine an outcome. In a whole series of battles from the period, it's clear that contemporaries believed that the bows, the English longbows, had enabled the English to determine the outcome, had enabled the English to win the battle, even when they were badly outnumbered and fighting on the enemy's home ground. Here's half a dozen battles before Crecy. At Crecy, I'll give you a moment here to read the quotations. The last one there I think is particularly telling because, of course, the English did win the battle. And if they did so killing more of the enemy by arrows than in other ways, then that pretty much indicates that the arrows determined the outcome. If you took the arrows away, less than half as many French people killed, they probably would have won. At Poitiers, same thing. French were defeated by the arrows. Fired on by the arrows, the 2nd Division began to retreat. The archers fired so thickly that the 3rd Division couldn't stand their shot. No one could or dared to withstand their fire. They wounded and killed many men in the battle. And of course, the English, as an undisputable historical fact, won the battle even though they were badly outnumbered and far from home. At Agincourt, more or less the same thing. Those on horseback were so afraid of death they put themselves in flight away from the enemy. The leading horses were scattered. The archers caused maximum damage with their arrows so that they could not get close enough to the English to engage in hand-to-hand combat. That's a reference to the English archers they could not get close enough to. And if you look at the Battle of Agincourt, there's a map. Now, there are different interpretations of how the English were arrayed, but every map I've ever seen, every interpretation agrees that some of the, in addition to the fact that the cavalry forces which charged the archers on the wings were routed by the English archers, the dismounted men-at-arms who advanced against the English men-at-arms here, the heavy infantry essentially, were on a wider front. So some of them were coming straight at the archers, and had the archers not been able to defeat their attack, the English men-at-arms would have been enveloped, swept around both flanks, and completely demolished. So there is no way, this is a contemporary source quoted, or actually a somewhat later source, but a near contemporary source quoted on the right here, and I think what it says is clearly true. Had it not been for the success of the English archers in first repulsing the French cavalry and then helping to repulse the French who were advancing on foot, the French would have won the battle. They were about 4 times as numerous, better armored, in better shape, and if they would have won the battle without the archers' capability, or even had the archers been there but been using crossbows or composite short bows or wooden self-bows, then that means it was the longbow that made the difference, that decided the outcome, and therefore that the bow should be considered a decisive weapon, which was not. So.